We shouldn't have been there. We shouldn't have destabilized. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, right? He was a bad guy, really bad guy. But you know what he did well? He killed terrorists. He did that so good. They didn't read him the rights. They didn't talk. They were a terrorist. It was over. Today, Iraq is Harvard for terrorism. You want to be a terrorist, you go to Iraq. It's like Harvard, okay? So sad. So sad, okay? So sad.
It's Britney, bitch.
And the Iraq, everywhere, like, such as.
I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and we're in here talking about practice.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Out, Charlie! Out!
Our next door neighbors are foreign countries.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Remember Shuffle. My name is Ben. With me as always is my co-host Giordano.
Hello, I'm here to do the podcast. Here to talk about Three Kings. Marky Mark, one of my favorites. George Clooney, very handsome.
And today we are joined by the all-time returning Remember Shuffle guest, JD. Say hi, JD.
Pleasure to be here. Hello.
And today is part one of a 3-part series on the Iraq War. We have talked glancingly about the Iraq War for many episodes now. One of our early episodes was on Iraq War op-eds, which we overconfidently named Part 1 and then never returned to. We talked about it on Pat Tillman, on Zero Dark 30, on drones, 2 episodes JD was on for. And now we are finally facing it head on because the Iraq War was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 2000s. And until 2022, 2023, with Ukraine and Gaza, of our lifetimes, which is why we're dedicating 3 whole episodes to it. So each one of these episodes will cover one period of the war, as well as one movie about that period. So today is kind of like the prologue. We're going to be covering mostly the 80s and 90s, as well as the 1999 David O. Russell film, Three Kings. So we are going to be focused on the United States' relationship to Saddam Hussein. I know we're a 2000s pod, okay? But this is your prologue. This is a full episode of table setting, because in order to understand 2003, you have to understand the 80s and 90s first.
Yeah, we're going to start in like 1979. So sorry that it's not mostly the 2000s, but there's this funny story of Saddam being debriefed in 2004 by the CIA. And they were like, where would you like to start in the story of your life? And Saddam was like, I would like to start in ancient Mesopotamia. So we're not going to be starting that quite that far back, though we could. We're going to start in about 1979.
Part 2 of this series will focus on the selling of the war by the civilian leadership, the reaction post 9/11, the conflicts between the military and civilian leadership, as well as the early phases of the war. And then part 3 will focus on the occupation. So here's our basic thesis for the episode. In the Trump era, there's been a ton of Bush apologia or Iraq war amnesia. I once hate watched one of those stupid PragerU videos in which Judith Miller, the journalist who parroted the WMD lies in the New York Times and got a Pulitzer Prize, she toed the line that making intelligence mistakes is not malice, which is pretty much the official party line of NatSec people now, is the war was a mistake, but it was an honest mistake. We really thought they were WMDs, and we really tried to do the right thing. And so the thesis for this episode in particular is that, no, it's not an honest mistake. This is an entirely preventable war of presidential choice, in the words of journalist Steve Cole. And it's entirely America's fault. And this episode is going to particularly focus on the CIA's decades-long mishandling of Iraq and Saddam Hussein that led to this war. Or put another way, this war didn't need to happen, but America made it happen.
Yeah, and I think the through line that I've come to look at the entire Saddam story through is what is important to Saddam. And I think the number one thing that is most important to Saddam, as we'll see, is staying in power, right? keeping his regime, and how the CIA and the National Security Administration in general fundamentally did not understand this about Saddam. All of Saddam's decisions make sense if you look at them through this lens of what will keep me in power. There's this story of George Bush in the 2000s talking to the CIA and saying, hey, why didn't Saddam take our offer to step down from Iraq in 2003 when we said that was on the table? And it's like, you're misunderstanding what's important to Saddam. You have to keep in mind that everything Saddam did was because he wanted to stay in power. It's why he was looking for WMDs originally, because he knew that offered a deterrent to someone coming into Iraq and toppling him. It's why he didn't have WMDs once we started weapons inspections, because it would have given us and the UN a pretense to get rid of him. And it's why he wasn't harboring terrorist groups, because that would also give them a pretense to end his regime. Would he help Al-Qaeda? No, probably not. Nothing matters to him as much as staying in power. And so helping Al-Qaeda would not advance that goal. It would act in opposition to it. And so we'll see throughout this story that all of Saddam's decisions make sense from the lens of, will this help me and my extended family stay in power?
Before we really get going, bibliographical note, the main source that we use for this episode is Steve Cole's recent book, The Achilles Trap, which we recommend in the strongest possible terms. It is an incredible read. It's this 500-page tome that alternates between talking about the CIA, talking about Saddam, talking about Saddam's family, talking about some of these Iraqi nuclear scientists and their lives. 10 out of 10 would recommend.
Yeah, and he wrote this via not only interviews with all of these national security people, but also through thousands of FOIA requests, documents that we captured in the war in Iraq that he was able to get access to and read through. He did the work of reading through lots of boring documents and summarizing them for you. So I highly recommend that. I also read Debriefing the President, a book by John Nixon, who was a CIA analyst who got to speak to Saddam a bunch of times, one of the few Americans who got to speak to Saddam in 2004 before he was killed. And highly recommend that. That one's much shorter if you want a shorter read.
Okay, here's our roadmap for the episode. A lot of this episode will consist of a history lesson. Then we'll talk some of our themes and big ideas, and then we will turn to Three Kings. So, part one of our history lesson, the period from 1979 to 1990, which is the golden age of American-Iraqi collaboration. America had broken off relations with Iraq since the 1960s for various Cold War reasons that we can't get into. There's some coups, there's some Israel stuff, but the Iranian Revolution in 1979 changes everything, as well as Iraq's invasion in 1980. So in 1982, the CIA has a mission to persuade Iraq to accept American assistance in its war against Iran. America is freaking out because they want to contain the Iranian Revolution at all costs, and the war is not going well for Iraq. America's main concern is preventing the toppling of the Gulf state autocracies that pump out lots of oil. So President Reagan signs this top secret national security decision directive that authorizes the United States to, quote, do whatever was necessary and legal to prevent Ayatollah Khomeini from toppling Saddam. And the important thing to stress, at this point, in 1982, the only contact between Iraq and America is through the fucking three-letter deep state agencies. There's zero diplomatic recognition, there's no embassies, there's no State Department, there's no civilian leadership talking to each other. Only the spies and spooks are talking on behalf of America.
Yeah, this is real spycraft stuff. Meetings in unlit rooms at airports where intermediaries would have conversations. Really kind of what you expect from spies.
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong? Only the spies are talking to the dictator. So the CIA is offering this highly classified imagery that they have through spy satellites and spy planes that show the Iranian battle positions on the fronts to try and give the Iraqi forces an advantage. And Tom Twetton, the CIA operator who flew to Iraq on this mission, he was told to stay in Iraq as long as it takes to set up a channel to share intelligence. And he was also told, do not ask for anything in return. This is an American gift. No strings attached. Because the main thing the Iraqis are suffering from is bad leadership. Saddam's going to the front, he's micromanaging, he's meddling. He had sacked all of the competent generals because he thought they were a threat to his regime. It didn't have worse tanks or worse planes. Its only problem was leadership and intelligence. And there's a really funny story where Saddam's half-brother, Barzan, was suspicious of the CIA. And he begged Saddam to send them away. And this Twetton guy recalls pleading, We're talking about Iraqi lives, and we're talking about the President of the United States wanting to help you. But Barzan was unyielding. We don't need it, we don't want it, and you can leave. And the Iraqis are totally right to be suspicious, because at this time, one of JD's favorites, the absolute ghoul Henry Kissinger, was out there publicly saying that the best thing for America would be for both sides to lose. Yeah, you got this guy saying, like, we just want as much chaos and destruction as possible on the one hand, and then the spies are saying, here's a bunch of free intel for you.
Yeah, and we get some insights into how Saddam thinks about the United States. I think he sincerely believes that him and the United States should be friends. We know from this story that he overrules his brother in terms of accepting aid, because don't forget, he's like a secularist president, right? And so he understands that what America doesn't like about Iran is that they're Islamicists and that they nationalized a bunch of the oil companies there. At this stage, he hasn't been wronged by them and is open to collaboration.
Yeah, he's also a middle power, right? And he's constantly trying to play the French, the Soviets, and the Americans off one another, because any one of these much larger countries could decimate Iraq. So he's in this precarious position, and he's trying to get what he can from whatever superpower he can.
I think he was like a much better vice president than he was a president, because he took Iraqi living standards quite a ways from like 1970 to 1980, electrifying the country, introducing literacy and education programs. Yeah, he's a much worse president than he is a vice president.
Classic Joe Biden situation. So it would later be revealed that the spooks and spies were, in fact, clandestinely supporting both sides. And there's kind of a funny story where the Iranians are under this arms embargo after 1979, and so they should not have been able to resupply their army, which was all American-made stuff from the period of the Shah, who was a tight U.S. ally. And yet somehow they could. And Saddam immediately blames the Israelis and the CIA and America, and it turns out he was right.
No.
The Israelis were providing all this weaponry in order to both help Iranian Jews escape and just generally to sow chaos in the Middle East.
Yeah, never good when a paranoid anti-Semite is proven correct. It doesn't do great stuff for their inherent paranoia.
So yes, the Iraqis, they're accepting the CIA help. They do these regular meetings with the CIA to get intelligence. And America's goal for this partnership, with what was already a pretty brutal dictatorship, were twofold. Number one, the realistic one, was just contain Iran and the Iranian Revolution, right? We're playing geopolitical chess. Number two, which is the absurd one, was to coax Saddam into the camp of moderate Arab allies, like the kings of Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and they really thought they could get him to crack down on Palestinian militant groups that were based out of Iraq, and, pie in the sky, maybe one day use him to advance peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So yeah, they basically think that Saddam is manageable. 1983, 1 year later, we get even more deepening relations when one Donald Rumsfeld,
Old Rummy.
Yeah, old Rummy himself, rolls up to Iraq on behalf of the State Department, 17 months into this intelligence sharing program that probably saved the Ba'athist regime of Iraq from being toppled by Ayatollah Khomeini. And I just want to quote Steve Cole because it's a heck of a sentence. Yet the US and Iraq still had no formal diplomatic relations. Rumsfeld, who carried the title of personal representative of the President of the United States in the Middle East, had been assigned to strengthen the tentative alliance and move toward the restoration of full relations whenever Saddam was ready. So Rumsfeld brings Saddam a pair of golden spurs, because he knows how much this gangster peasant from Tikrit loves horseback riding.
Yeah, there's this great story, too, of Rumsfeld showing up. All these meetings generally happen, I think, at like the Baghdad airport in like one of the rooms in the basement. And he shows up to this like room in the basement, and Saddam's representative wheels in this TV, and they show him this parody video of al-Assad, the Syrian president at the time. And it's just clearly like an actor playing al-Assad, and he's killing civilians in a spoof video and then laughing about it.
They probably made him short, too.
Yeah.
There's shots of women biting the heads off snakes, and then it cuts back to the actor playing Assad clapping, as if he's clapping for, like, snake biting.
That's awesome.
And Saddam's representative is like, expecting Rumsfeld to find this very funny or at least very convincing of Assad's evilness. The idea that anyone would think this is compelling to an American is very funny to me.
Yeah.
Like, look at this evidence/comedy video we have.
A lot of cultural misunderstandings at work.
It's kind of what memory TV is, though, right?
I don't know what that is.
Oh my gosh, you guys. First of all, any memes of like sort of TV from Arab countries where people are acting insane will often have this memory TV watermark on it. And that's because memory TV is, I think, the Middle East Media Research Institute, which is an Israeli media channel thing that's just... It's called the Middle East Media Research Institute to show you just what normal Arabs think, basically. And what they do is it's all the most insane stuff. And sometimes not that insane, like awesome shit like Palestinian Mickey Mouse getting murdered for his land. But it's just like, it's an Israeli like media thing that just shows all the most insane stuff from Arab TV to try to show the world how fucked up they are, right? And it's produced some awesome shit. You know, like, Wallah, you will taste my shoe. Do we know that one, folks?
No.
A lot of the memes come from that.
It does seem like memory TV for sure then. That's a perfect reference.
Yeah, I'll be sharing some of those with you later.
It sounds like they're acting in good faith.
Yeah. You guys know about FAR 4?
No.
FAR 4, Palestinian Mickey Mouse? All right. It's a pretty sad story, honestly.
Okay.
We'll look at it later.
All right. So at this point, America's getting even tighter with Saddam because of what's going on in the Lebanese civil war, the Beirut bombing of the Marine barracks, and Syria had just invaded Lebanon in this complex, multifaceted civil war. And they think that Saddam is the key because Iraq and Syria had beef, like Jordana was just saying, so they can play one side off the other. Now, during these meetings, Rumsfeld tells the Iraqis that America could use its influence to mediate a settlement of the Iran-Iraq war, but there were certain things that make it difficult for the Americans to do so, namely Iraq's use of chemical weapons in the war, as well as Iraq's human rights record. Important. They say that it's difficult, but not impossible. The chemical weapons use, the human rights, is not a deal breaker for America in this time. That's the signal that Rummy is trying to send to the Iraqis. Now, speaking of chemical weapons, let's check in quickly with America's developing ally and partner in the Middle East. In 1984, Iraqi Major General Maher Abed al-Rashid spoke publicly, saying, quote, "The invaders should know that for every harmful insect, there is an insecticide capable of annihilating it, whatever their number, and Iraq possesses the annihilation insecticide." And on the next day, Iraqis inflicted 2,500 casualties on the Iranians with mustard gas and the nerve agent Tabun, T-A-B-U-N, which is the first time that was ever used in battle. How does America respond to this? America just all lives matters Iraq's war crimes away. The statement from the State Department reads, "The United States strongly condemns the prohibited use of chemical weapons wherever it occurs. There can be no justification for their use by any country."
God damn.
This is your ally. You are giving them intel, and they're like, you know, we condemn any use. And it gets worse, boys. The message qualified the criticism by denouncing Iran's unwavering war aim of eliminating the legitimate government of Baghdad.
Wow. Us hoes ain't loyal.
And it gets even worse because this is their public statement. In private, they even walk back this tepid criticism to the Iraqis. An American diplomat told his Iraqi counterpart that America's public criticism of Iraq's use of mustard gas reflected, quote, "strong U.S. commitment to long-standing policy, but should not be misunderstood as an anti-Iraq gesture." The key message for Baghdad was that our desires and our actions to prevent an Iranian victory and to continue the progress of our bilateral relations remain undiminished.
It's like if you invite a friend to a party and then that friend throws up in the living room and you're like, I condemn throwing up in any living room, wherever it might happen.
And so this point bears repeating. From 1984 to 1988, when Iraq was gassing Iranians as well as the Kurds, they were doing it thanks to CIA-provided intelligence.
It was certainly difficult for Steve Cole to point to like a specific battlefield where our intelligence led to the gassing. But listen, we're providing broad, general overviews of the entire battlefield where then chemical weapons are used. It's not that big of a jump to imagine that having better intelligence in general would have resulted in the optimal choosing of places for the chemical weapons to be launched, especially when the intelligence we're giving them was where troops were concentrated.
Yeah, that's like a 4th grade level of obfuscating your guilt. Like, no, I'm not the one who tipped over Jimmy's wheelchair on the playground. I'm just the one who told everyone how easy that would be and that they should do it.
So, by August of 1984, hooray, everyone, the CIA had saved Saddam's regime. Baghdad has a 4-to-1 advantage in armor, an 8-to-1 advantage in combat aircraft, plus all the chemical weapons. 1984 is also the year that the Reagan administration formally recognizes Iraq.
They put an embassy in Baghdad for the first time.
Here is what National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane thought of Iraq in 1984. Iraq has moved away from radical anti-Western domestic and foreign policies. As the chief barrier to the spread of Iranian-supported Islamic fundamentalism, Iraq is promoting regional stability in the course of securing its own defense.
My heart and my best interests and my best intentions still tell me that's true.
For context, Iraq invaded Iran first. So,
yeah, in a war that would kill 1 million people.
In 1986, the Iran-Contra scandal breaks. So Saddam had always been suspicious of the Americans and the CIA, thinking that they were conspiring against him along with Iran and Israel. Chalk one up for Saddam. He was right on this one. They were.
He was a big fan of reading the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and quoting it and stuff. And so, yeah, it's just never a good idea for someone who already thinks that way to then learn about Iran-Contra and be like, I fucking knew it.
So the good folks at the newsroom discover that the Reagan administration had been secretly selling weapons to Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran in collaboration with Israel to secure the release of American hostages that were held by Iranian proxy groups in Lebanon. But it even gets worse, because they used those profits from these arms sales to fund the Contras, which was in violation of U.S. law. Now, we don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty here, but I do love how the DC Attorney General tried to spin this. Jordana, you want to read this with me as a dialogue, so it's not just my voice?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be the DCHE. Certain monies were taken and made available to the forces in Central America, which are opposing the Sandinista government there.
How much money, sir?
We don't know the exact amount yet. Our estimate is that it's somewhere between $10 and $30 million.
And how did it come to your attention?
In the course of a thorough review of a number of intercepts and other materials, the hint of a possibility that there were some monies being made available for some other purpose came to our attention.
It's so great how you can make language accomplish nothing at all.
Just a truly flawless use of the passive voice and intransitive verbs. Like, no notes.
The hint of a possibility. I love the hint of a possibility. What a word salad. The hint of a possibility that there was some monies being made available for some other purpose. What is that saying? I swear I speak English, and I cannot make sense of what they're trying to say there.
There are still a bunch of question marks around the specifics of Iran-Contra, but it really does look like the CIA gave Iran a shitload of intelligence, also basically supporting both sides of this brutal war to maximize casualties. The deep state is big and complex and has various factions that were literally hiding operations from one another. And this is just this short-term thinking that defines American foreign policy. Let's support Iran in what's essentially a hostage deal, but it does some pretty irreparable damage to America-Iraq relations, right? Like, why would Iraq and Saddam ever trust America again when this scandal was revealed?
Yeah, America has all of this satellite imagery, and it's just like, well, let's just give it away and see what we can get for it. I mean, in the case of Saddam, it was just a gift, but for Iran, it was the vague promise to help us with some hostage somewhere in Lebanon, right? It just seems like one of the worst deals, and to irrevocably ruin your relationship with Saddam, right? A guy who's already paranoid about your intentions.
How old was Saddam at this point?
In his 40s, I think. He turned 65 in the lead up to 2003.
Yeah, you're going to do that to a country that's also led by a dictator for life who's only in his 40s, and you're going to fuck them over.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be dealing with the same guy until you kill him.
Yep.
And I thought the whole point of this was that you want Iraq to win, right? You know, Ben, I think you called it, it's just the hour of the wolf. There is no overarching strategy. It's just people going in different directions, trying whatever they want.
Yeah, it's probably mostly incompetence and short-term thinking, but Saddam sees this as manipulative genius, top-down conspiracies everywhere, right? But somehow this relationship keeps going. So during 1987, they're working hard to bring Saddam back on board. So the Americans revive Operation Staunch, which is the arms embargo on Iran. They send some economic aid and some bank credits to Iraq, invest in the economy. Saddam starts receiving American diplomats again. It really is like a toxic situationship that America and Saddam are in the 1980s. And what's wild is that because the deep state is so big and massive, as we said on our drones episode, there is a second secret operation to give Iraq military intelligence on Iranian positions run by a different corner of the deep state called Operation Druid Leader, which is a sick title. That's run by the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, during the post-Iran Contra period because Saddam was kind of cool on the CIA.
No, Saddam, this isn't the CIA. This is the DIA. Just moving through all the letters.
Yeah, LT smash.
So there's some more bad faith dealing from the American deep state. I want to quote Steve Cole here. The DIA officers' instructions were to provide battlefield intelligence on Iranian forces that would help the Iraqi Air Force bomb Iranian military formations and infrastructure behind the front lines. The targets would include, listen closely here, large-scale troop concentrations, groups of ships moored near one another, railroad trestles, and important bridges. The goal was to disrupt Iranian preparations for the presumed spring offensive. Yet the Americans were instructed not to provide any intelligence of, quote, direct, immediate tactical value to Iraq. Wait, what? Sorry, all of the bridges and troop formations, all that shit wasn't direct, immediate tactical value? Because the Americans don't want to be seen as taking a side in this war, especially the side of the brutal dictator, but they do want that brutal dictator to win his war. And of course, we're kind of hitting the same notes over again. There's a bunch of war crimes with gas attacks during Druid Leader that the Druid Leader people 100% knew about, but they have the plausible deniability and the fig leaf. So like one of the guys who's working there says, the DIA was not telling the Iraqis, put sarin here, but did they know that that's what the Iraqis were going to do? Of course. So as we wrap up the 1980s, we got to talk quickly about the Kurds.
Yeah, the war comes to a close. And Saddam turns his attention to the Kurdish areas near the border.
Yeah. They do some particularly brutal ethnic cleansing of the Kurdish areas. This is how Chemical Ali earned his nickname. The operations are called anfals, which is the Arabic word for looting, and there are something like 5 or 6 of them. The details are pretty harrowing, but the point that I want to stress is that when Saddam is at his most brutal is also the period when the Americans are most tight with him and don't voice any objections. And this would color his relations with them later. This would color how he views the Americans.
Yeah, I think that's the thing you see a lot in this book, is that Saddam's trying to get a sense for what the Americans find acceptable and not acceptable. And it's really hard because you certainly can't do it at like a moral level. Because in like the late 80s, when we're redoing diplomatic relations, you know, we're normalizing relations with him, he's gassing his own people in Kurdistan. So he's like, okay, like this is fine. I can do this. Doesn't seem to affect my relationship with the United States. He always has like a very difficult sense of understanding what is fine and not fine.
Yeah. As we'll see when we transition to part 2, like the difference is the end of the Cold War. That's what he misreads fundamentally. In the 80s with the Soviet Union, America will put up with a lot of shit in their fight against what they see as communism, or Iran in this case. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, in the unipolar moment, the rules change, but Saddam doesn't. So in 1988, H.W. Poppy Bush signed National Security Directive 26, which extended that Reagan-era tilt towards Saddam. It says, quote, normal relations between the United States and Iraq would serve our longer-term interests and promote stability in both the Gulf and Middle East. During this period, there's a ton of economic credits and investment from Western companies. The forces of capital are pro-Saddam, basically. And when some Congress members lobbied for economic sanctions against Iraq because of Saddam's treatment of the Kurds, the H.W. Bush administration killed the bills. So, the poor Kurds, the most betrayed people in history. Okay, so that's part 1. That's Saddam and America in the 80s for our little history lesson. Anything to add before we move on?
Saddam was a big fan of the Kurds. He saw them as being honorable, simple people. And one of his idols, Saladin, was a Kurd.
Yeah.
So his hometown hero. From Tikrit. But yeah, basically, he thinks the United States poisoned their minds with ideas of sovereignty. But until then, he thought that you could trust them more than anyone else on Earth.
Okay, so on to the second and final part of our history lesson, from 1990 to basically 2000. The Cold War ends. The New World Order is born. What is Saddam's relationship to the West going to be now that he can't play superpowers off one another? What will America do with this unipolar moment? Shout out to Saddam one more time for absolutely calling it. Quoting the Iraqi president, "We believe that the U.S. will continue to depart from the restrictions that govern the rest of the world until new forces of balance are formed." He claimed America's priority would be controlling oil and helping Israel.
Wow.
Yeah, remember how I said you could understand all of Saddam's geopolitical movements by just the lens of wanting to stay in power? You could maybe understand all of the United States' geopolitical movements through that lens as well. Controlling oil, helping Israel.
They rejected him for he spoke the truth, or whatever that means. But still, in this period, the West is trying to expand trade with the Iraqis, right up until the invasion of Kuwait. So I want to tell this kind of macabre story very quickly, where there's this British investigative journalist named Farzad Bazoft. He wanted to uncover evidence of some of the war crimes against the Kurds, and he gets caught in Iraq and tried as a spy. And the UK ambassador recalled being briefed by the Thatcher government that, quote, "Iraqi-UK relations have always been tricky, choppy, but your job is to keep them smooth enough that we can do good business." Saddam decides to execute this guy, quote, as punishment for Margaret Thatcher.
What did Thatcher do specifically to Iraq?
Maybe he was just a big fan of the IRA, Saddam, and the Irish. It was her crackdown on Northern Ireland. And Britain's Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd advised that it was not in the government's interest to respond by cutting off trade. Quote, "Our competitors would happily step in to take up our share of the market," he wrote 5 days after Iraq hanged this British citizen.
He was unlucky once.
But yeah, the point of that story is it's just showing that our foreign policy often doesn't have any sort of moral sentiment behind it. Like, it's this realpolitik thing of like, hey, he can execute our citizens and we will not do anything if it's bad for business.
So over just 9 months in 1990, Saddam went from this tenuous ally that the West would basically let execute its citizens to international pariah state very, very quickly. 1990 is also the year that the Israelis assassinated one Gerald Bull, chief engineer behind Big Babylon, Saddam's supergun, and they killed him in Brussels. Now, JD, I know you're a bit of a Gerald Bull fan. You wanna sound off?
I mean, I don't know about a fan. Let me just say that 1990 is the year when another Three Kings came out. Let's just say.
Wait, what?
It's the year we were all born.
Oh, okay.
So you had said earlier that Saddam really wanted to build a giant gun. And as I've learned more about Saddam's giant gun and even gianter gun, Project Babylon and Big Babylon, I think this guy convinced Saddam that he wanted a giant gun. So this guy is the kind of fascinating dude that I don't think can exist anymore, where he was born in the Depression, and then his family won the lottery, and then, okay, so here's the thing. Throughout like the mid-Cold War, I think, right, we got rocketry. Everyone's into rockets, right? And during this time, you also have this dude, Gerald Bull, who his special interest is artillery. He brands himself an artillery scientist, which I think sort of in title sort of puts him in opposition to a rocket scientist.
It sounds like a position that would exist in late 19th century Prussia. I am an artillery scientist.
So, well, the thing is, that's kind of the problem, right? Is that for most things, except for a few things that we obviously still use big guns for, like rockets do a lot of things a lot better, including, most critically, putting things into space. So this dude who turned down a invitation to medical school at age 16, I don't quite understand that, to get into aerospace engineering or whatever it was called then. That's how bad this guy wanted to shoot stuff into the sky real fast. But he was supposed to be this genius, and he ended up going to U of T. He was a U of T guy. And yeah, and then it just parlayed his various positions at the university and then into Canadian Air Force research into just better and better positions. So this dude founds this research group and becomes an actual international man of mystery. He becomes, if Nicolas Cage had come into arms dealing from an interest in the engineering rather than just wanting to make a lot of money.
I want to build the biggest gun of all time.
Yeah. So this dude actually did make a name for himself, building these sorts of cannons for testing missiles and stuff, right? And he did end up actually working developing missiles for the government. But his true passion was artillery science.
Freelance artillery scientist.
He becomes freelance because they finally got sick of him after someone leaked to the press that the Americans were going to fund the Canadians to build some sort of giant gun to shoot stuff into space, to compete with the Soviets. We're going to launch stuff into space with a gun. Someone leaked that to the press. And when that got to his superiors, because it wasn't true, they were like, I think the guy who everyone hates, who's obsessed with artillery science, maybe have been the guy that leaked the fake artillery science story to the press. So everyone was tired of him. He started his own company and then ended up, selling arms to some of the hits like Israel and apartheid South Africa. And actually went to jail for a bit. But yeah, eventually he ended up working with Saddam.
Saddam, we should note too, he wants a giant gun as deterrence so he could point it at Israel, right?
Not ostensibly, right? So ostensibly. At worst, I think this was Bull's claim, it was to be able to shoot a goo missile into space to disrupt spy satellites.
Why would Saddam want that?
Exactly, right? So it's plausible, but here's the thing. A gun this big, you guys know what the Paris gun is?
Was it like a World War I gun?
It's World War II. The Germans built, I think until this time, the biggest artillery piece ever, right? Well, but the way this thing aimed, you can't have a traverse and elevation mechanism for a gun that big, at least not with the engineering constraints at the time and whatever shitty materials Hitler was working with at the time too. It's crazy that he was trying to have them build all this shit when one of their main things was their inability to produce good materials and shit by the mid-war. Anyway, it was designed to be able to shoot Paris, but the fucking thing, it could only aim by being on this curved section of railroad track and just going forward and back along this curved section of railroad track. And that is how the gun would aim because it was so freaking big. And then Big Babylon was going to be even bigger, and it actually just had to be built into a hillside, like a berm. So it was ostensibly to shoot satellites out of the air. How is it going to do that when it can't aim and it can only aim at one thing? So
well, that's a question for Gerald Bull to figure out.
It was a question for Gerald Bull to figure out. But yes, it was ostensibly to do the Queen ability from StarCraft 1 to spy satellites, where they go into the little cloud and they can't see anything. I don't think Israel believed them.
So anyway, yeah, we got this Canadian guy who's trying to build a Looney Tunes style gun for Saddam, and he's killed in Belgium, right, by the Mossad.
So, listen, he's found dead by being shot 3 times in the back of the head outside of his apartment in Brussels. Now, when I say he came into crime, not from being a genius criminal, but from being really passionate about the engineering that people weren't allowing him to do until he went to despot regimes and apartheid states. So this guy had an apartment in Brussels, and I think he was going back and forth from there to Iraq, and he would come home to find his apartment broken into and nothing stolen, okay? This man who's working to build a Tel Aviv gun with Saddam Hussein. This happens multiple times, and he keeps living in this apartment in Brussels. I want to say, it shouldn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, if you're doing all this stuff and your apartment's getting broken into and nothing's taken, that maybe you should move. But I guess it does take a rocket scientist, because this artillery scientist was found dead, shot several times in the back in Brussels, with a briefcase still having $20,000 cash in it. So yeah, Big Babylon didn't work out. They had to smuggle the tubes for this stupid gun in.
Aluminum tubes.
Here's the thing about a gun. You ever seen a regular gun that has its barrel in sections? They had to ship this thing in with the intention of, I guess, bolting the sections together, which just, I don't know if y'all have heard of Kentucky ballistics, but you don't fuck around with a gun barrel and the pressures inside of it. So I shudder to think what this thing would have done after a few shots. It was going to be powerful enough that I think it was going to be a seismic event. So yeah, I don't know. If the shell didn't hit Tel Aviv, I feel like a nut or a bolt would have at that point. So it's probably good they didn't finish it.
You gotta respect the dreamers in this world.
You gotta respect the dreamers, you know.
Yeah. Shout out to one of the biggest gun autists of all time.
Truly, an actual gun autist. Like, that's all he wanted to do was beat rockets with guns.
He had no ideology. It seems like he just wanted somewhere to ply his trade. You know, he probably would have built the Looney Tune guns for anyone.
Yeah, he was trying to build them for us. And you know what? Diefenbaker or whoever I'm sure was the one who wouldn't let him.
In the 50s?
I don't know. I love that you actually know Canadian history enough to know that I'm wrong.
If you remember the American version, you just try to remember the Canadian version. So like Diefenbaker, that's Canadian Eisenhower, right? Mulrooney, that's Canadian Reagan.
Well, let me think about this, though. If the dude was born in 26, so by 46 he's 20 and already... The guy got a PhD by 23, by the way.
Damn.
So, yeah, by the 50s, this guy actually was working on some shit. Listen, I don't know the timeline. Born 26, died 90. So actually, I might not be that wrong.
Okay, well, let's get back to the story of Saddam Hussein. So yeah, we're right on the precipice of the Gulf War, I'm sure, as you know, now that we're in 1990, right?
And maybe something we should have said in our 80s session, just very briefly. Yes, during this period, Saddam does have a secret nuclear bomb program that no one knows about. And they are being very secretive and very careful about it. They're trying to basically run the same script as Oppenheimer in the 40s to make a very basic, rudimentary kind of nuclear bomb as a form of deterrence. Because, yeah, I mean, Saddam is actually kind of a rational actor on this front. He wants to stay in power, and the Israelis bombed and attacked one of the only civilian nuclear reactors in Iraq.
Yeah, I was going to say, Ben, wasn't it one of the ones that absolutely could not have been used to enrich uranium?
Correct, yes.
Irockenheimer.
Ooh.
He's got his fingers in a lot of pots, which was the purpose of the giant gun story, right? Saddam wants to stay in power, and so he's developing a nuclear weapon, he's developing the giant gun that he can point at Israel. He's developing chemical weapons. He's got a lot of seed investments that he's making.
And right up until the invasion of Kuwait, America's out here sending senatorial and congressional delegations now, not just the deep state, to Saddam. And they're telling him that Saddam could be a very influential force for peace in the Middle East. But after the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq's not doing great. Economy in tatters, lots of war widows, war orphans, and a shitload of debt to those Gulf states, whom Saddam never respected as a tough peasant from Tikrit. He thought that they were soft. They had never worked for their oil wealth.
And he also thought he was doing everybody a favor by going to war with Iran.
Yeah.
Right? He was like, I'm keeping away the Persian horde, right? He was like Leonidas in his mind and saying like, you know, you loan me this money, but also you should forgive it because I used it to kill Persians.
Yeah. I saved your ass.
I killed Shiites with it.
Yeah.
You know?
All of these Gulf countries have massive Shia minority groups that are like pretty oppressed. Iraq, of course, is a Shia majority country. So Saudi Arabia eventually does forgive a bunch of debt, but the Kuwaitis do not. And so in 1990, there's a big diplomatic crisis. Iraq starts saber rattling with Kuwait. He's moving troops to the border. Iraq has had border disputes with Kuwait since Kuwaiti independence because it's like a fake country invented by British colonialism. And his main casus belli is that he accuses the Kuwaitis of slant drilling into Iraqi territory and stealing some of their oil. He accuses them of flooding the oil market to drive the price down. He calls it diplomatic warfare, and he starts mobilizing troops on the border with Kuwait.
They literally drank his milkshake?
Yes.
Yes.
Wow.
I drink your goat milkshake.
Oh.
Kuwait just wants Iraq to recognize its borders and its state, and then they'll forgive the war debt. So, sidebar on Kuwait, as I said, it's a fake country run by an absolute monarch. Its emir fathered 70 children by 40 wives, but he made sure to constantly divorce and remarry, so he never violated Islamic law by having more than 4. He has an extended family of 1,200 that runs every government office and runs the country.
Awesome.
Yeah. And the country can only function because of all the non-citizen workers, of which there are twice as many as actual Kuwaitis.
I think it's 3 times now.
Yeah, like any of these Gulf states, like the Emirates also, or Qatar, or whatever. So, 2 points that I want to stress here. Number 1, it's kind of reasonable for Saddam to assume that nobody would miss this country. if it went away.
It does sound like a fake country created by colonialism, like you said. It's much bigger than I thought it was, too.
Point number 2, this country that's run by the fucking polycule absolute monarch.
Run by the Flanders family reunion.
This is the holy sacrosanct nation that 1 million people were mobilized to restore.
Jesus. More than the number of citizens. Or like, I know today it has 1.5 million, but yeah, it's just not that unreasonable to imagine. Like, why should this country exist?
Yeah. So everyone thinks Saddam is bluffing. The CIA is caught flat-footed, failed to detect the movement of Iraqi forces towards Kuwait. Embarrassing. And in the midst of this crisis, we get some diplomatic mixed messaging for the Americans. So the war with Kuwait is the moment when there is a clean break and America pulls the diplomatic recognition. America and Iraq will never be close ever again. So it's probably the most significant thing that happens in the lead up to the 2003 war. So as this diplomatic crisis is happening, Bush signs a letter drafted by his National Security Council congratulating Saddam on the occasion of Revolution Day, Iraq's national holiday, and it reiterates the American commitment to improving relations. And the Americans are kind of undone by all these bland, generic statements. So they say America, quote, remains determined to ensure the free flow of oil. We also remain strongly committed to supporting the individual and collective self-defense of our friends in the Gulf, with whom we have deep and long-standing ties. No reference to Kuwait, vague, vanilla statement, just generic diplomat speak. The Bush administration never lays out any hard red lines. It doesn't even name Kuwait, doesn't threaten any military retaliation if Saddam makes war on his neighbor. And this is something that people are going to seize on in hindsight, that they should have been firmer. They should have tried deterrence sooner, or at least said something. And there's a woman who takes a whole bunch of blame for this named April Glaspie, who's the ambassador to Iraq, where she has a meeting one-on-one with Saddam. All she does is parrot and repeat that official statement, that vague line. She stresses America's desire for friendship. And she says something like, all that we can hope is that these issues are resolved quickly, which later people accuse her of giving Saddam the green light to invade Kuwait. And there's this very funny story where as this diplomatic crisis spirals, some of the NatSec guys think about asking the president to issue a more strongly worded statement. But alas, the president, H.W. Poppy Bush, had hit a bucket of golf balls earlier in the day and his shoulders were flaring up. So when they go to talk to him, he's on the medical table receiving heat treatment. So he can't talk to Iraq and say, don't invade Kuwait.
I just thought this scene was so funny because it's like, yeah, this guy, his entire career in the CIA finally becomes president and yet can't even hit a bucket of golf balls without being annoyed all afternoon at the pain in his shoulders.
Imagine being John McCain and hearing that.
It should have been me.
Oh, no. And so as they're talking, Saddam invades Kuwait. And Desert Storm is significant because it draws America into one big war with Iraq to liberate Kuwait. And then that's followed up by a succession of these basically limited wars throughout the 90s and CIA covert action against Saddam. Follow the tumbling dominoes leads to 2003. So the point of all this, the US and the West had spent a decade pulling their punches with Saddam for all the reasons that we already outlined. But by 1990, the situation had changed, right? There's no more Cold War. Saddam can't get away with this kind of shit anymore now that they're the only guys in town. If there was a Soviet Union to veto the UN resolution, there would have been no war in the Gulf like this. But they let him gas the Kurds and the Iranians. So why shouldn't he feel like he could get away with invading Kuwait in 1990? Because they had tolerated everything he had done up until that point. You know, I kind of feel a little bit of sympathy for Saddam because he said as much when he was in captivity.
One of the only mistakes Saddam had felt that he had made was the invasion of Kuwait. He almost always has retro-imagined himself as being in the right for like every situation that's ever happened to him. But when people brought up Kuwait, he would get fidgety and be like, my fault. I probably did that one wrong.
I'm sorry, guy.
Yeah, when he was in captivity, he said to his American interviewers, if you didn't want me to go in, why didn't you tell me?
Yeah, true. Very difficult to read America, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I got a helicopter sidebar. since we got JD on the pod, who has advanced and articulated the official Remember Shuffle take that the helicopter is the world's most evil vehicle, here's a story about that idea. The invasion of Kuwait began when 100 Iraqi helicopters filled with special forces flew into Kuwait to try and kill or capture the royal family. But the Iraqi helicopter pilots had no night vision at all and barely any night flying experience. And Saddam's son-in-law advised them to, quote, fly as low as possible to avoid anti-aircraft missiles. 40 of the 100 helicopters crashed. Some collided with one another, others hit power lines, electricity towers.
In the Iraqi Apocalypse Now scene, the helicopters are just crashing into each other.
Oh my God. It's America's future.
As TrueAnon is fond of saying, do not get on that helicopter.
I say this about a lot of stuff, but they really beat you guys to the punch with that one.
So America mobilizes the entire world against Iraq. They are not going to let this one slide. Most of the rhetoric is pretty openly about oil and realpolitik, more than about Kuwaiti sovereignty or democracy, since Kuwait doesn't have it. Dick Cheney's out there saying the rest of the world badly needs oil, and that's why we're doing this.
Yeah.
And at this point, these panicking Gulf monarchies, especially Saudi Arabia, allow thousands of American troops to muster on their land. More than 800,000 soldiers would eventually come to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and this will be significant for later 9/11 reasons. Right? This is one of the first times that Saudi Arabia lets troops on its soil.
Wow.
Even Saddam was shocked by that. He actually did believe in some of Saudi Arabia's sacrosanctity and was very disgusted at the idea of American troops being there.
Yeah. So when Saddam finally talks to the Americans about this is his argument, quoting Steve Cole's book again. Why fight? If the U.S. would allow him to have his way in Kuwait, he could supply cheap oil to America for years to come. He also pledged that he would not attack Saudi Arabia as long as King Fahd did not allow his kingdom to be used to attack or destabilize Iraq. But if the U.S. sent its armed forces to confront Iraq, Saddam continued, America would face the spilling of the blood of 10,000 soldiers in the Arabian desert. You are a superpower, and I know you can hurt us, but you will lose the whole area. You will never bring us to our knees. And in defense of Saddam, after the past decade or so of U.S.-Iraqi relations, why wouldn't he think this would work? During this occupation of Kuwait, Saddam appoints Chemical Ali to be the governor of Iraq's newest province, and they do insane amounts of looting, which will be important for our film review later. So Iraq stole 3,216 gold bars amid a ton of other ransacking. A UN commission would later approve $52 billion in compensation payments. Iraq went buck wild in Kuwait. Yeah, Saddam's other miscalculation was doing his war in an era of cable news. Also will be important for our film review, because CNN is able to film the whole thing, and Saddam loses the propaganda war in a huge way. Any threadbare credibility he had just completely gone. And now, in the 1990s, is when we start to get our black and white, good and evil narrative. H.W. Bush, in his diary, is comparing Saddam Hussein to Hitler, after he himself, Poppy Bush, spent years trying to manage the dictator in the 80s. Now, a switch is flipped. And it's like, this guy is Hitler and must be stopped at any and all cost.
Which we'll see more of in our next episode, I guess, right? Like Wolfowitz and all them. They can't help but think of him as Hitler.
Mm-hmm. And so, as the U.S. plans for its first big war since Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, the planners, like Colin Powell, who served 2 terms of duty in Vietnam, and Norman Schwarzkopf are adamant about this thing called the Powell Doctrine. The U.S. should only fight wars with overwhelming force and clear goals and a decisive exit strategy. And so what this means is that the war is to liberate Kuwait from Saddam's Iraq, nothing more. That's the goal. We do that, and then we go home. And it means that even though Kuwait is this small country, we're going to bring 1 million soldiers to do it. This is significant for later in that America learns all the wrong lessons. The civilian leadership of the Bush administration is going to say, we don't need 1 million. We had 1 million for Kuwait. It was way too many. As they're planning, some people start to float the idea of regime change, but they decide that the best course of action is just do as much damage as you can to the regime and hope that it collapses on its own, which in turn informs the war strategy. Most of Desert Storm is an air war, where the coalition forces immediately knock out most of the civilian infrastructure, including electricity, sewage, etc., hoping that that would make them rise up against Saddam. But unfortunately, life was already pretty miserable in Saddam's Iraq, and so this wasn't quite the motivating tool that they thought it was. And they're constantly dropping propaganda leaflets telling people, rise up, rise up, rise up, throw them out.
Those ever worked? Everyone does that.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great point.
You came on for our Black Hawk Down episode, which again, I think was like another episode. We just seem to like fundamentally not understand how human beings operate and like believe like the psychology of other people, where we're like, what if we just destroy all of their civilian infrastructure? Surely the flower of democracy will bloom from that.
I think it's kind of like consulting, right? Like if you can't prove it didn't work, then someone's job just depends on them just still doing it. And I guess they're just still doing it, right? Like no one can prove the leaflets don't work. So like the dynastic line of like leaflet guys and their sons who become leaflet guys, I guess just keep the job going.
Yeah, if I picked up a piece of trash that had been dropped from an airplane from some kind of Chinese drone that was like, rise up against Orange Cheeto, I would crumple it up and be like, fucking resistance libs. Why are you doing this?
Saddam's political maneuvering in this war was to launch Scud missiles at Israel, hoping that Israel would join the fight. And because America had a bunch of Arab allies, Saddam would be able to be like, you're really going to fight on the same side as Israel? It's so funny that their mere presence is that poisonous that America's like, why don't you don't come? Why don't you not come for this one? Just being like, yo, is it cool if my friend Israel pulls up? And being like, no.
Yeah, there's a moment where after Saddam launches the Scud missiles in like the coordination center of the war, every Saudi officer is standing on their feet cheering next to these Americans. Some of them are shouting Allahu Akbar, and the Americans are just very uncomfortable as they watch this happen. Israel is pissed, but they're like the Lemmy Adam cartoon mouse, where they really want to get involved. But like Jornado said, they're so poisonous. And America is already bombing the shit out of Iraq so bad that Bush had to say to the Israeli prime minister, Israel couldn't do anything that we aren't accomplishing already. Don't worry about it, bud. We got the war crimes handled. It's fine.
150,000 dumb gravity bombs ranging from 500 to 2,000 pounds each. Insane.
Yeah. That's how much they dropped on Iraq. Estimates for the Iraqi military dead is like 10 to 12,000. Some estimates are higher. These are, of course, mostly conscripts that are sent to the front line.
Great for a country that's just finished a decades-long war.
And then by mid-February of 91, Bush, for the first time, openly tries to incite some kind of coup or an uprising. He said that there was a way for the bloodshed to stop as they bomb and bomb and bomb. And that way is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside and then comply with United Nations resolutions.
This is a real turning point. It's our first time where we're trying to do regime change, and we become fixated on regime change after this point. It's like Castro, where we're sending those exploding cigars and everything. And it's just so funny because obviously that doesn't make any sense at all. If that happened in our country, if Iraq was like, oh, I just have to get rid of George H.W. Bush and everything will come my way, you would obviously be like, you're a moron. That's not how that would work at all. You can't just get rid of one guy.
Yep.
We talked about this on drones already.
It was Black Hawk Down, General Butt Naked.
We talked about this just every time something involves like U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yes, it was on drones as well.
They just thought, we just assassinate this guy.
The Hamburglar, whoever,
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is a real shot in the dark from the government because the CIA has zero contacts in Baghdad at this point. So they have nothing to even facilitate the coup that they want to happen. Okay, yada, yada, yadaing over the end of Desert Storm. The bombing continues. There's a 100-hour ground war. The highway of death. That sounds moral. The coalition flies 5,159 air sorties in one night to continue bombing the shit out of Iraq. And American military leadership at this point is obsessed with not having a Vietnam. This is a period where Vietnam was in such recent memory and was such a big deal for the boomers who were running the government that they need to get the ending right. Bush is out there saying things like, we don't want to lose anything now with charges of brutalization. We do not want to screw this up with a sloppy, muddled ending.
So they could have just not done it. I feel like the best way to not get a Vietnam is to not do it.
Yep.
And like spend that money on healthcare. I don't know.
Yeah, how many healthcare sorties did we run?
And so they start negotiating a ceasefire. And JD, I got a treat for you. I got evil helicopter digression number 2 in the pipeline ready for you. So Norman Schwarzkopf is negotiating with the Iraqis. There's a ceasefire line, a big green line, and no Iraqi planes are allowed in the sky anywhere in Iraq, and especially not near the ceasefire line. And the Iraqis ask, are helicopters okay? And they say it's to ferry government officials around the country where all the bridges and roads are out, within Iraq only, no international flights. And Norman Schwarzkopf thinks that this is a reasonable request. He says, fine, no fixed-wing aircraft can fly, and helicopters have to stay away from the front lines. But otherwise, he says, absolutely, no problem.
20,000 dead.
Yeah. His Iraqi counterpart is gobsmacked. He says, you mean even helicopters that are armed can fly in Iraqi skies, but not the fighters? And Norman Schwarzkopf says, yes. And this is how Saddam Hussein would put down the Shia uprisings against him.
Oh my God.
This man is a general.
It does sound kind of on purpose, because a helicopter is, if you're the imperial power, it's like, yeah, a helicopter. That's a thing that we can keep contained and basically can make sure it doesn't get close to us, but can absolutely be done to perform all of the horrific massacres that the operator of the helicopter needs to if their target doesn't have anti-air. Mm-hmm. But like, if you have jets in the air, then like, what the fuck are the helicopters going to do?
Yeah. So after the war, the south of Iraq, which is mostly Shia, rises up in rebellion against Saddam. The problem is that they're highly schismatic. There's no umbrella organization. They're in the mix. There are Iranian proxies. There are Shiite Islamists. There are communists. There are other Shiite groups that aren't affiliated with Iran. And so between the communists and the Iranian proxies and the fact that there's no one leader, there's no way for the Americans or anyone else to support this decentralized movement. And here's what's so galling and offensive about this episode is that the Iraqis were doing what the CIA told them to do in the fucking leaflets and what their like Radio Free America broadcasts were saying, the explicit words of President Bush. Everyone was telling the Iraqis, rebel, rebel, rebel. And it's a cruel irony that the Bush administration that is so obsessed with the ending of the war and the exit strategies did nothing to plan for this specific scenario that they themselves encouraged.
Yeah, truly a dog chasing cars, like the Joker says in Batman. Have no idea what to do if it caught it.
Yeah, oh shit, they actually did. Yeah. Yeah, and there's this guy, Richard Haas, a White House policymaker from the Middle East. He recalled, quote, an unfortunate loss of focus and letting up after 7 months of nonstop crisis. They literally said, I'm bored now, as the rebellions start. And then when people started to criticize the Bush administration, why aren't you supporting the rebellion that you fomented? The official line that they said was, we respect Iraq's sovereignty. Even saying, we don't think that outside power should be interfering in the internal affairs of Iraq.
Hilarious thing to say after you've destroyed all of the civilian infrastructure and dropped leaflets encouraging people to rebel.
We respect your sovereignty.
It's like serial killer shit, man.
Yeah, Saddam crushes the rebellion in the south. The U.S. even lets them keep flying the helicopters because they don't want to get bogged down in a quagmire in Iraq. If Saddam's number one motivation is staying in power no matter what, America's number one priority in this period is do not get involved in another Vietnam.
This is kind of forgotten, but it's interesting, I guess, that at the time, the memory of Vietnam was strong enough to have actually stopped us from another occupation.
Good to know America can temporarily learn lessons. The rebellion then spreads to the north and the Kurdish regions. Saddam also crushes that. It generates 1 million refugees on the Turkish border in these massive camps. And pretty soon, as many as 400 to 1,000 Kurdish civilians start dying a day. And once again, the Bush administration decides to take no military action because they're hyper concerned with optics. The crisis threatened to, quote, mar the political narrative of a clean victory in Kuwait. And they're very concerned because they already have a ticker tape parade planned.
Oh my God.
1,000 Kurds died a day so that we could have a ticker tape parade.
We need to exercise the ghost of Vietnam. It was good for us. This was like our Eat, Pray, Love tour, you know? Okay, so now we move on to this new stage of Iraq-United States relations, which is that Iraq is a pariah state. We have discovered that they have a nuclear weapons program. We've instructed them to get rid of it. And so removal of Saddam becomes the number one priority, right? It's also during this period after the Gulf War that the WMD program becomes clear to the world. Mm-hmm. The UN passes a resolution that places Iraq under crippling sanctions. I'm sure if you've listened to Blowback Iraq, you're familiar with the absolute level of degradation. Go look up like Iraq's GDP per capita over time, and you can see that the level of incomes in Iraq went back to where it was in like the 40s. It was a very destitute country due to the American sanctions in the 90s.
Yeah, and they say that the sanctions will let up once Saddam acknowledges and destroys all of Iraq's nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And so there's this big bumbling comedy of errors throughout the 90s about these UN weapons inspections. The Iraqis are trying to hide things that aren't hideable, like giant iron discs called calutrons that are 15 feet across and weighed 17 tons. They're sealing up documents in rail cars and sending them around the country. And Saddam is playing some bizarre four-dimensional chess where he can't comply with the UN orders because he needs to save face. He needs people to think that he might have WMDs, but he also needs sanctions relief. So what he settles on is that he secretly destroys his weapons programs, which ensures that no one in the West will ever trust anything he has to say about the programs ever again. He is secretly cooperating, which is bizarre. To quote Steve Cole again, when the frenzied work was completed, Tariq Aziz could credibly say that Iraq had no chemical weapons. But the world would have no reason to believe this. And because the destruction had been carried out without record-keeping, photography, or other forms of proof, Iraq had no means to show persuasively what it had done should it choose to come clean.
Yeah, again, that lens of Saddam wanting to stay in power, this is how you perfectly explain these things, right? He wants to stay in power, so he gets rid of the chemical weapons. But he also wants to stay in power, so he's doing it secretly. Because if he doesn't have weapons of mass destruction, then you can invade his country.
Yeah. There's this really macabre, grimly funny scene from the 2003 war where as the Americans are invading, in one of these Iraqi cabinet meetings, people are asking each other, do we have WMD? They're not sure.
I did want to point out earlier, I feel like people need to understand how much more murderous it is to put sanctions on a country after you've bombed its infrastructure into the Stone Age. That's like a real force multiplier, and it's a different world of suffering you inflict when you have just bombed people's like sewage and especially electricity, and then you sanction them against the ability to rebuild that. Unless you want to accept their help, but that I'm skipping ahead a few years.
Yeah.
So I don't know, sanctions just, I think, undersells it to people when this story is told.
Yeah, it is quite the euphemism to be like, oh yeah, we had sanctions. And it's like, no, this 500,000 excess child mortality deaths. That's the real result of, not being able to import medicine.
Yeah.
It's etymologically related to the Latin verb to make sacred. So really euphemizing there.
All right, it's the 90s, as everybody in the movies said back then.
Come on, Uncle Phil, this is the 90s, man.
I can be anything I want to be. It's the 90s.
Man, it's the 90s. It's hammer time. Come on.
Out there, it's the 1990s. But in this house, it's 1954.
Does your girlfriend have a girlfriend?
Hey, it's the 90s.
And we have disassembled Iraq's WMD program. We're sending thousands of weapons inspections into the country every year. We are enforcing a no-fly zone over Kurdistan.
The north and the south, Kurdistan and the Shiite regions. And the CIA also has its fingerprints all over these inspections. It is under UN jurisdiction, but the CIA is supplying the intelligence, they're supplying some personnel, which would be a big problem down the road. Steve Cole calls it as fully a CIA-led operation as it was possible to assemble under UN auspices. So the same people who are doing the weapons inspections, which is part of a disarmament program that will lift the sanctions allegedly, are the same people who are pretty openly trying to do regime change in Iraq. Right.
Yeah, this was, I think, one of the most insulting parts of the book, or at least just like the most galling. Basically, there's this guy, Scott Ritter, who later was discovered to have child pornography. So take it with a grain of salt, I suppose. But he was a guy working with the UN weapons inspections that said that he was instructed by the CIA to use the weapons inspections as an opportunity to place listening devices in Iraq so that we could target Saddam Hussein for assassination, placing essentially black box recording devices in Iraq to transmit encrypted radio signals to a U-2 spy plane. Full on using the weapons inspections as an opportunity to kill the president of the country. Crazy. Absolutely infuriating. And for Saddam, who's a paranoid guy to begin with and who's only concerned with staying in power, kind of forcing his hand as far as these weapons inspections goes, right? It's like, I allow them to do it, which undermine my ability to have a deterrent to stay in power. And if I allow them, they're also using the information to try and target me for assassination.
And there was no chance that Iraq could ever prove to the world sufficiently that it had no weapons. And yet they kept doing the inspections. It was never enough. And so eventually, by 1998, Iraq throws out the inspectors and never lets them in again until 2002 in the lead up to the war.
To give you an idea of the number here we're talking about, between April and October 1997, the Special Commission carries out more than 870 visits, of which they were blocked only 6 times. When they were blocked, it was because they were trying to inspect places that Saddam might be present, like his palaces. They were blocked 4 out of 5 times, which leads to a confirmation bias, where the US thinks that they must be hiding weapons in Saddam's palaces. This is where we were blocked. Not understanding that, no, it's because you're also trying to kill Saddam that they're blocking you from inspecting the palace.
Yep. So here's the state of affairs throughout the 2 terms of the Clinton presidency, the 90s, right? Here's everything America is doing to Iraq. Number 1, the 2 no-fly zones. This is a low-level, simmering conflict with complex rules of engagement that are constantly threatening to draw America into another Iraq war, basically. And there's this passage in the book that I just want to summarize, where Steve Cole says the rules of engagement, very complex, but they seem pretty straightforward to me. These are the rules of engagement. If an Iraqi aircraft flew into a no-fly zone, American plane shoots it down. If an Iraqi aircraft flew into the no-fly zone and then escaped, an American plane would chase it and shoot it down. And if Iraqi ground forces fired at American patrol plane, the U.S. would destroy that Iraqi unit or facility. Steve Cole says, but there were many subtleties and caveats. I'm like, what can't they do? This is the Simpsons joke. That's a paddling. And then there are occasional flare-ups. No American pilot ever gets shot down, but that's always a risk for the Americans. But in 1998, as the Monica Lewinsky scandal is breaking, they launch Operation Desert Fox, which is 600 sorties that bombs a bunch of sites and kills or wounds over 1,000 Iraqis. Just constant monitoring of the skies and occasional bombing throughout the 90s, a low-level simmering content.
Team America World Police.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it our job to do this? I'm sounding like Trump, but why do we have to do the hundreds of sorties? Isn't it all of this costing a tremendous amount of resources that we're simultaneously stripping out of the welfare system at this point, using it to bomb Iraq and do constant inspections?
Yep. Also during the 90s, you have the CIA trying to overthrow Saddam using Iraqi exile groups. Again, listen to Blowback for more on Ahmed Chalabi, but you have multiple groups of Iraqi exiles like the Iraqi National Congress and the Iraqi National Accord who are getting bankrolled to the tune of millions of dollars a year by the CIA. Very much like Cuban exiles Bay of Pigs style shit. The CIA's strategy is prepare, wait, exploit. Wait for the moment where some general thinks he can take out Saddam and then support him. And all of the coup attempts are just these bumbling failures and embarrassments.
They're so funny when they're describing them in the book. There's a moment where Alawi is approached by the CIA and he's shown a PowerPoint presentation on doing a coup in Iraq. Truly the McKinsey coup PowerPoint deck, right? Where they're going slide by slide and it's step 1, free Iraq. Step 3, profit. Can you imagine getting your hands on one of those? If anyone has the CIA coup PowerPoint deck, please share that with us.
Yeah, remember shufflepod@gmail.com. Yeah, as we already said, they're doing constant weapons inspections, and they had basically all but camped out in Iraq, doing as much as they pleaded. These inspectors had the authority of an occupation, even if they were unarmed technocrats. They could order the demolition of entire factories. They collected the country's remaining stocks of uranium, shipped it to Russia. Rather than being ineffectual pussies, the UN is straight bossing Saddam around in the 90s, regularly censuring him when he doesn't comply, and giving the tacit threat of running back Desert Storm. This is a coercive disarmament mission. And of course, as we already said, there are crippling economic sanctions on top of the no-fly zone, on top of the inspections, on top of the attempted coups. And the thing is that the USA and the West just lie. There's no intention of ever relieving these sanctions. They weren't a means to an end. They they were the end. The end was getting rid of Saddam. Just total bad faith acting. Clinton is briefed by his intelligence agencies that the pressure of the sanctions and the inspections might lead to Saddam's ouster. So just keep the pressure up, right? Keep this pressure cooker of a country going throughout the 90s so that you can get the end result that you want, which is no more Saddam, without having to do a war. Just to put some numbers on the facts that we already said, Iraq's economy shrank from 180 billion in 1990 to about 13 billion in 1995.
Yeah, and the 1990 figure is already at the end of like a 10-year long war in terms of its economic output.
And yeah, this 500,000 dead children to malnutrition and the like. The humanitarian crisis is pretty hard to overstate. Joy Gordon has written about it, saying that Iraq experienced, quote, a catastrophic collapse of every system needed to sustain human life as a result of the massive destruction from bombing, the inability of Iraq to import goods, and the collapse of the economy. Now, here's the point I want to hammer home, and this will basically be the end of our history section here. By the end of the 90s, America had the Iraq problem solved. They had contained Saddam militarily, but there was a high cost in like the military expenditure, the distraction, the human suffering. They had avoided a full-scale war. Through some ardent support of the UN Special Weapons Commission, they had dismantled all of Iraq's WMD programs. And to quote Cole again, there was no modern precedent for such large-scale coercive disarmament by unarmed inspectors. Unfortunately, Clinton did not understand how successful the Special Commission had been, and nor did the commission itself. They had won. It was done. And yet, it is around this time that we get the rise of the neocons and think tanks like the Project for a New American Century that's really beating the drum for regime change in Iraq. And thanks to this neoconservative lobbying, Republicans on Capitol Hill managed to pass the Iraq Liberation Act, which enshrined regime change in Iraq into federal law and started giving U.S. taxpayer dollars to the exile organizations. Clinton signs it. So there is your table setting for the pressure cooker that had been built in the lead up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
All right, so now that we're done our history lesson, let's just talk a little bit about some of the themes and big ideas. The first being Saddam Hussein. The man, the myth, the legend.
I mean, Sacha Baron Cohen's The Dictator character is basically a composite of the West views of Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi combined. But you probably know the basic contours of this view. Saddam is a paranoid autocrat with a cult of personality who can and does execute civilians at will. He's also got some ostentatious tastes, luxury cars, a lot of gilded and golden stuff. And there's certainly an element of truth to those stereotypes in the West, but the real Saddam is way more interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the real Saddam thought of himself primarily as a writer and a reader. When he was in captivity after 2003, whenever he was caught, the main thing that he complained about, he was like, I'm a writer, keeping a pencil from me is a human rights abuse, right? This was a guy who authored many books, including like a 500 or 600 page book, a love story, like a thinly veiled allegory for, it was called like The King and I or something, and it was like a love story where the woman was meant to be the country of Iraq and the king was meant to be him.
Yeah, it's an allegorical novel that talks about politics, and the people of Iraq demand executions. Like the woman demands executions when there's a plot. It sounds very funny. I've heard it said that it's like an erotic, smutty novel, but Steve Cole's summary says it's much more of a political allegory.
I also heard that he was like a smut writer.
We said that, I think, in our Spike TV episode.
Oh, wow. I learned it from you? Can't believe we've come this far.
Yeah.
Yeah, truly, we've come full circle on that detail.
Yeah, I mean, he's a hillbilly gangster. He's from rural Iraq. He's from Tikrit, but he's also a Machiavellian lion fox. He's got the strength of the lion and the cunning of the fox. That's how he's able to stay in power for so damn long. But yeah, there's stories from early Saddam's life where he's fighting in the streets. He's part of an assassination attempt on one of Iraq's earlier dictators. And he's a guy who grew up in this rural setting where he and his half-brother got involved in a clan feud where Saddam killed one guy and Barzan, his half-brother, killed 4 as part of this blood feud. He is tough in an interesting way. but the cunning that he has, whether that's in playing different superpowers off against one another, or even just how he ran the state. Like, everyone knows about the brutal repression and the totalitarian police state. The guy had like 3 different secret polices so that they could monitor one another in this overlapping weave. Pretty smart.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who is able to come to power and hold power in a sectarian state like Iraq has to be capable of cunning and an understanding of how to hold and use power.
It's not all just stick. He's also got carrot. So he's big on patronage and generosity. So he's constantly gifting luxury cars to folks like the scientists in his weapons program. There's a story where in 1975, as vice president, he visits France, and the future president of France, Jacques Chirac, described him as intelligent, not devoid of humor, and even rather nice. But rather than leave a little tip for the cleaning staff, he asked for the name of every single person who worked at the hotel and mailed them $1,000 after the fact. And on like this more systematic level, he poured all this money into literacy drives and healthcare and industrialization and electrification, weaponry, and technology. There was a carrot to go along with this stick.
He also had a family large enough that he could enforce his political will just through one of his many like half brothers and cousins.
Mm-hmm.
This patronage family was very clan based as well.
Yeah.
A lot of the people working for the Mukhabarat, I think, had to be from Tikrit and of the same clan.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, he's also a guy who does have like a cult of personality. He's putting his face and his statue everywhere. He's got songs and poems glorifying him on the radio. And one of my favorite Saddam stories is that he renovates Babylon. He like bulldozes a bunch of the old ruins and rebuilds them and makes sure he puts his name in it where it's like renovated by President Saddam Hussein. And he sees himself as the inheritor of Hammurabi and the rest.
Yeah, he saw himself in the image of Saladin, the other famous guy from Tikrit. It's funny that you mentioned Jacques Chirac said he was not absent of humor, because when he was being debriefed in 2004, he would sometimes tell a funny story, and almost all of his funny stories involved like someone getting bonked on the head. He's like, "Oh, you like that one? Let me tell you another one where someone was hit." So there was always someone getting physically abused.
There was a French guy who said this, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there you go.
And yeah, I don't want to do full-on Saddam apologia, because as we've spent a couple hours telling you now, life in his Iraq could be pretty brutal and arbitrary. His barber was jailed in a secret police torture prison for showing up late to a shift.
I have a controversial opinion that there is actually a difference between good and bad things, regardless of the person who does them. That's my patented wise man take.
Yeah, what can we say about Saddam? His son was worse.
Here you go.
Yeah, in conclusion, Saddam Hussein is a land of contrast. There's more to him than the parodies that we see in Western media.
Yeah, certainly more to him than the South Park parody.
And I think this might be a great time to mention, did you fellas know he got the key to the city of Detroit?
No.
Mm-hmm. He gave a bunch of money to a Chaldean church in Detroit, and Coleman Young gave him the key to the city of Detroit. So
that's actually so sick.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mentioned earlier, he was a secularist, right? This was his way of being able to hold power in Iraq, right? Was to ostensibly separate religion from politics, right? Unlike Iran, unlike Saudi Arabia, because you do have so many different ethnic groups in Iraq. But later in life, he became more religious, like most people. And a funny story from his debriefing was that he would often use prayer as an opportunity to like stop the interview if they were asking him about, say, his second wife or say human rights abuses. He'd be like, "Sorry, I have to pray. I gotta go. Sorry." Except for the interviewer did note that one time he decided to like butter up Saddam by being like, "You kind of remind me a lot of Abraham Lincoln. You're from a poor background. You were a wartime president." And then the guard came in and was like, "It's time for your prayer." And Saddam, in this case, was like, "You screw the prayer. Tell me more about how I'm like Lincoln."
Yeah, they were both wartime presidents. The difference is that Abraham Lincoln didn't start his wars. Okay. Our second big idea is the conflict in foreign policy between the realists and the idealists. So, your terms, right? The realist foreign policy sees geopolitics as basically a chess match. Countries have national interests and should use their power to advance their national interests. Morality is taken out of the equation. An idealist foreign policy sees geopolitics as necessarily aligning with the country's morality, and we should advance a more just and peaceful world through policies. And part of the reason for the fiasco that is the Iraq War is that America is bouncing between all of these things. In the 1980s, the U.S.'s strategy towards Iraq is one that's grounded in pragmatism and realism. The U.S. has certain interests to advance, containing Iran, supporting Israel, economic investment in Iraq, and they will do whatever it takes, and they'll let Saddam do whatever he wants to do to advance these goals. Nothing to do with morality. See above for the story of Thatcher just letting a Brit hang, or Reagan and Bush killing congressional resolutions to support the Kurds.
Yeah, or like when that one ship was attacked, right? What was the U.S. warship that Saddam attacked? And they were like, yeah, don't worry about it. You know, just keep killing Iranians.
An Iraqi jet fired 2 missiles at the USS Stark.
Many U.S. sailors died, and our reaction was, oh, people make mistakes. Don't worry.
That's why pencils have erasers.
And so, yeah, you can see this sort of realpolitik at work up until the takeover of the U.S. presidency by the Neoconservative wing and ideology of George W. Bush, where the like fundamental ideology and like decision-making point of view shifts during the George W. Bush administration and during Clinton to a certain extent, because he's a big liberal interventionist, right? This is our end of history moment. Kuwait, the Balkans, Iraq, right? We just want to do our liberal intervention.
Yeah.
So we're seeing this shift in the way that we make decisions from the 90s into the 2000s.
Yeah, exactly. Saddam now becomes bad guy number 1, and he has to go. And so America can never really pin down a consistent strategy on how to deal with Iraq. And this inconsistent, herky-jerky nature to this approach just leads to the cascading catastrophe of the Iraq wars, plural. But yeah, the realpolitik isn't even that good.
No, as we mentioned, they sour their entire relationship with Saddam to gain a vague promise of helping with some hostages.
But it's at least better than the neocon approach.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so funny about this is like, I think the preferable option to all of this would just be like to not be involved at all.
Yes, the superior foreign policy is neither realist nor idealist, but non-interventionist is the best foreign policy. Okay, we can do a very quick theme, big idea. Read Steve Cole's book, it's great, but the Game of Thrones style feudal politics of Iraq's ruling family. So because Saddam is this absolute monarch, basically, with his cousins and family and sons, it means that this interpersonal family drama can have this cascading geopolitical effect. He has his 2 absolutely useless sons, Uday and Qusay, who are out there, you know, killing people and just generally raising a ruckus. Nobody wants to see them in power. But he has his son-in-law, who's also a bit of a fail son, but more competent than Saddam's actual kids, that Saddam is sort of trying to groom for success. And this is the guy who decides to make this major shift in the nuclear weapons policy that eventually leads to the West finding out about it. So just these little moments of power play within a ruling family that can have these cascading effects is pretty interesting to read about. And they're also really interesting characters.
Yeah, we skipped over the Hussein Kamal story, but he suffers a brain injury and then defects because he thinks that the United States will support him. But like all of these things, once the United States has the thing that they want to happen, they're like, we don't know what to do with this.
Hussein Kamal also had this harebrained idea where they're like, okay, we want to do a coup. How do we want to do it? Because he also thinks he'll get to be president after the coup. And his harebrained scheme was to buy hundreds upon hundreds of luxury Mercedes in Jordan, drive them to the border with Iraq, and be like, any defector gets a free Mercedes. This was his plan.
The BBC in the 2000s made a TV show called House of Saddam, which I did try to watch. It is so bad. Just so boring. The one like hilarious note that I'll add about it is that they had Saddam played by an Israeli, which feels like the ultimate insult. So maybe Saddam was like, they are shapeshifters. Maybe.
Last 2 big themes. One is the central lack of intelligence agency, to quote Meet the Fockers. I'll just say there's a reason that Steve Cole's 500-page tome is focused specifically on the relationship between the CIA and Saddam Hussein. George W. Bush is most responsible for the 2003 war, because it was a war of choice for him. But if there's any organization that you want to blame for the fiasco that is America and Iraq, it has to be the CIA. And it's not because they're the all-powerful, all-knowing organization that Saddam thought they were. It's because they're wildly incompetent, bumbling moron bureaucrats who punched themselves in the dick constantly. They're just very short-sighted in everything that they do. So they'll give Saddam all the intel he needs to save his regime from Iran, which also allows him to gas the Kurds. They drop thousands of leaflets and psyops telling the Iraqis to rise up with zero plan to support them after the fact. And they should know better. You've seen Saddam squash dissent before, or them funneling millions of dollars to these absolutely criminal, lying Iraqi exiles to try and overthrow Saddam.
Like Chalabi and Alawi, right? Like, that's where your tax dollars are going, to this scam artist who tells you that, yeah, I could be the new president of Iraq, and they definitely have WMDs, just telling you whatever you want to hear. I mean, we're not quite in the George Bush administration. That'll come in a later episode, but something you really realize reading these books is that if you're an analyst at the CIA, the best way to advance your career is to tell the decision maker what they want to hear, right? So like George Bush or Clinton, whoever, they're asking an analyst to come to the White House, and you're going to be very unpopular if you don't tell them what you want to hear. And so there's this like great incentive to tell the president what he wants to hear. The problem with this is, why have the analysts at all, right? Like, why spend all this money on analysts if their only goal is to tell you what you want to hear? Just do the thing you want to do. Don't even bother with the analyst then, if you're setting it up so that it's just reinforcing something you already want to do.
And the question should be raised when it comes to the CIA. How much is incompetence and how much is malice? The answer is, of course, both, but in varying degrees. So in the 80s is mostly colossal incompetence. You got various factions of the deep state supporting Iraq and Iran, sometimes hiding it from each other. Maybe let's do 80-20 incompetence over malice. But in the 1990s, we got to boost that up on team malice. Maybe we flip it to 80-20 malice incompetence. Trying to do regime change to what is essentially a contained, starving Iraq is bad and wrong. And doing it in the comically incompetent way that they do is somehow worse.
I mean, the line is not necessarily that fine. If you're knowingly incompetent in a job where many, many lives are at stake, then not quitting and like going and being an hourly employee somewhere, working at the Nebraska Dunkin', that's malicious. That's malicious to do.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, final big theme. Too much of Middle Eastern politics hinges on Israel. Saving the best for last. Israel is constantly meddling with Iraq, which does not help with the paranoid, autocratic, anti-Semitic strongman. So, like, just a few examples. In 1979, some Mossad saboteurs broke into warehouses in Iraq to blow up parts of their civilian nuclear reactor. In 1980, Israelis tracked down an Egyptian scientist working for Iraq's nuclear program to a hotel room in Paris, where they promptly bludgeoned him to death with an ashtray. And of course, I think most significantly for Saddam Hussein, Israel bombed that same civilian nuclear reactor at tThe. 10 Iraqi soldiers died, 1 French technician, and just the audacity of America's closest ally. They fly the mission with jets sold to them by Americans, and they don't tell any country that they're doing it. They don't tell the Americans. They don't tell Jordan or Saudi Arabia who they need to fly over. They inform 0 foreign governments ahead of time, just bomb Iraq. And so you kind of gotta put a little bit of blame on them. Saddam's fixation with WMDs hinges on the very logical notion of deterrence. This is what the West was always talking about with the Soviet Union, mutually assured destruction. And I don't think it's any fucking coincidence that Iraq's chemical weapons program was launched quite literally the day after Israel's surprise raid on the nuclear facilities of tThe. This is cause and effect.
North Korea has nuclear weapons now, right? And like, they haven't used them. And I think it's because people like Saddam understood that this is something you can have that means foreign governments can't remove you from power, right? And all of these things that Saddam was doing, chemical weapons, the Big Bertha gun, Big Babylon, sorry, the nuclear program, all of this is done to hold on to power. And I think if we had understood Saddam better, we would have understood that if he were to actually have used any of these things, it would have resulted in his oust from power. And so he would not have done it.
Yep.
But he saw Israel with a nuclear weapon. He saw other despots with nuclear weapons, and he noticed that the only people who cannot be removed from power are those that have a deterrent like that.
Yeah, and I mean, since 2003, we have a great example of the contrary phenomenon, where Muammar Gaddafi had a WMD program. He cooperated and collaborated with the West. He got rid of all of it. And how did we repay Muammar Gaddafi in around 2011? We came, we saw, he died, Hillary Clinton said.
That's the statement of a freak A human freak.
Yes. I finally get to use the soundboard. Thanks for getting me the pod track, by the way.
All right, cool. Are we done with the history stuff? We'll move on to the movie.
I do have a quick echoes in the culture section.
Okay.
This will be pretty quick because I feel like we'll save our big echoes for the culture.
Yeah, I mean, this is part one of the echoes in the culture.
Yeah. The biggest echo in the culture of everything we talked about is the 2003 Iraq War. That's the echo in the culture of everything that here, which you'll hear about in part 2 of this series. The biggest echo in the culture is the South Park Saddam Hussein parody, whose joke basically boils down to he's gay with Satan. Do you get it?
Yeah, this whole episode I've been struggling to come up with any sort of compelling reference to make to South Park Saddam because I've got such fond memories of like BLU. But yeah, that is just the whole joke. He's gay with Satan. There's like nothing else, and he's the top. That's about it. He was alive then, by the way, which I find which is like does kind of make it kind of fun. As he was for the making of a certain movie. Well, what'd you guys think? Did you see it as kids?
I didn't, and I'm shocked that I didn't, because this is the exact type of movie that in high school we would have loved.
Oh,
you know?
Hell yeah.
I did see it as a kid, but basically all that I remembered was throwing the C4 football at the helicopter. I remember Marky Mark's valve wound that stuck in my brain. And then I did vaguely remember that the thesis of the film is that America should have done more back in 1991. If only we had done more.
Yeah, it's so funny that this movie was made in 1999 and the thesis was like, we didn't do enough in Iraq. It's like, well, boy.
Do I got some good news for you? But yes, as JD said, Saddam was alive when this film came out. So let's discuss David O. Russell's Three Kings.
David O. Russell, by the way, a director who he also made like American Hustle. He got in trouble recently because he was like working out with his trans niece and without asking, grabbed her breasts and was like, oh yeah, these feel pretty good.
What? No.
He kind of looks like Jeremy Piven, and after hearing that story, I kind of feel like he acts like it as well. So yeah, the plot of this movie is that we have 3 soldiers played by George Clooney, 90s era Mark Wahlberg, and Ice Cube.
Yep.
And they go AWOL right at the end of Desert Storm during the Shiite uprisings to steal the Kuwaiti gold. You know, it's sort of like a heist movie in which they're trying to steal the gold that Saddam stole from Kuwait.
Yeah, I was always confused because the film is called Three Kings, and there are 3 handsome leads, but technically there are 4 soldiers that go on the mission. The hillbilly, the southern redneck hillbilly, played by Spike Jonze, right?
Oh my God. That's who Spike Jonze is? God damn. Okay.
Yeah,
the director of Jackass.
Yeah, like all heist movies, I think it's going to be quick and easy, no guns, get in, get out, get the gold.
We'll be back by lunchtime, George Clooney tells them.
Yep, but alas, it goes wrong.
Because they find themselves in the middle of the Shiite uprisings and decide we can't just let Saddam's army kill these rebels. We need to help them. We need to get more involved than we intend to. But that's a pretty nice allegory, if you ask me.
Yeah. And so after the mission goes tits up, Mark Wahlberg gets captured. And so they cut a deal with these Shiite Iraqis. They're going to help them get Mark Wahlberg back. The soldiers are going to help them get to the Iranian border so that they can become refugees in Iran. They're all going to take a little cut of gold. And then they'll go back to the front lines where the massive army in Kuwait is headed.
Simultaneously, during all this, there's a reporter who's desperate to find a story to tell in Desert War. You know, this is the big media war. And this reporter is also trying to sort of report on the gold and following them around.
Yeah, she's this parasitic barnacle on the war, you know? She rejects all these stories because they've already been done. She doesn't really care about the suffering or any of that. She cares about getting her story.
And winning an Emmy, yeah, specifically.
Yeah.
And defeating Judy Greer.
Yes, defeating Kitty from Arrested Development, her rival reporter.
Yeah, this is kind of like a soft sequel to your Arrested Development episode. You got Maybe, you got Judy Greer's character. They're all here, folks.
Wait, who's Maybe?
Okay, Maybe is a little child. There's a little child. That's Maybe.
What?
She's okay. It's not the child with the cast hands, but there's another little child who's in that movie, and you see her right near the end. I'm like, that's Maybe. That's a tiny Maybe.
That's a freebie.
And Michael Cera as Barzan El Takriti.
And at the end of the film, Spike Jonze dies. It's very sad. Mark Wahlberg is very injured, but they make it to the Iranian border, and it's looking like they're all going to get it. They've buried the gold to go back for it later. And as they are walking these Iraqis up to the Iranian border, the U.S. military catches them. They're under arrest. They're going to be court-martialed for going AWOL. The helicopters come down, and they put our heroes in zip ties. And our heroes are helplessly watching as, instead of being allowed to cross into the freedom of the theocracy of Iran, the Shiites are rounded up in a cage by the Iraqi border guards. And they're shouting that, please, just let us help and then you can arrest us. Please, American military. Please, American government, just let us do more. And eventually our three kings forego their own financial reward. They look at each other, they nod knowingly, and they tell them that they know where the Kuwaiti gold is. And they give up the prize for the heist in order for the military to disobey orders, talk to the Iraqis. They don't even need to fire a shot. They need to talk to the Iraqis to let these refugees get into Iran.
And we wanted to talk about this movie because the milieu, that most of the plot revolves around the idea that at the end of the Gulf War, Iraqi soldiers wouldn't shoot at American soldiers because it would complicate their task of putting down the rebellion. And so George Clooney and Ice Cube and Marky Mark are able to act with impunity, basically, around Iraq and sort of trick them into thinking that they represent the full authority of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this interesting representation of the geopolitical situation that we've talked about today. So we just thought it would be like a nice little cherry on top after this sort of more straightforward history lesson.
It is for like what's ultimately kind of just like a fun action movie, heist movie, dark comedy kind of thing. It's impressively moored in reality. The Iraqi soldiers, except for a few moments, are not mustache-twirling villains. They portray the actual chaos of there being three different armies, essentially, in one area, and how on, like, the village-to-village level, it's basically just, like, warlordism, including the U.S. soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a lot of thoughts on this movie. I'm still processing it. It's like, there's a lot to love about this movie. It doesn't all come together. It kind of got kind of boring, and it's maybe a little bit hard to follow some of the like middle plot developments, but like there's a lot of charm to this movie. I like this movie a lot.
Yeah, me too.
And it's not perfect like at all, and it does get kind of boring, but I don't know another movie like this that, even though in the broad overview it still has those sort of insidious imperial messages about like, yeah, come on, these U.S. soldiers, they're just good guys, but really on like the microscopic level, it is very just connected to the fact that these people are human beings on every side, including the Iraqis. Even though they're the bad guys, they're still like, there's cowards and there's loyal folks and there's people who are swayed by money and all this other stuff, you know?
Yeah, and that's why I thought the movie was instructive, is to say, if you get involved in a situation, it will probably, like, ruin you, right? Like, that's ultimately, like, how this movie ends. I didn't really, like, fully internalize the lesson it was trying to tell. But, you know, there's this quote, I can't remember who's saying it, but it's about George Clooney's decision to try and save the rebels from being executed by the Republican Guard. And he says, "You stupid son of a bitch, you were home free." The second that they start to care about the people in Iraq, it ruins their plan, right? This moment of caring opens up the floodgate of concern that they cannot fix. They have no ability to actually fix. That's kind of what the movie was trying to say. Unfortunately, the movie ends with them fixing the problem. But up until that point, the like general lesson of trying to fix this will undo you, I thought was interesting and good.
Yeah.
And on the non-interventionist side, there's this other quote. The main villain is played by actually the guy who plays Barzan Al-Takriti in the House of Saddam series, like the sort of handsome torturer character in this movie. He mentions that his daughter had died in the bombing. And he's torturing Marky Mark by pouring oil down his throat using like a CD.
To keep his mouth open, yeah.
To keep his mouth open, yeah, which I thought was such a good visual representation of like American culture and technology and like oil. It looks great. And he says, "How would it feel to bomb your daughter?" And Mark Wahlberg responds, "Worse than death." And I think the point the movie was trying to make is that if the inevitable part of war will be killing civilians at some point, just because this is how war works, the natural reaction to the people who live there is going to be this, that you have caused pain worse than death to me, and so I hate you.
The movie tries to walk this very fine line at times. The ideology is, I would say, largely on team, we should have done more, and it is good to do more. But there are also these lines where, yeah, like in that torture scene, they discuss what was this war all about. And Marky Mark has to say, like, for Kuwait, for stability, you can't go around invading places. And the torturer has to be like, what about all the bombing of Iraq? It's a very, very fine line that the movie tries to walk, not always successfully.
Yeah, by having you empathize with the torturer, right? But then also arguing for more intervention.
Yeah, I think we're so deprived of anything anti-war, which this movie is not, that just literally having the enemy torturer be like, yes, I have reasons for doing this, feels like such a treat to watch. Also, they show the ceiling falling on the child, which I thought it was very jarring. And obviously they need to do that more since people on our side of the globe are still cool with that. I thought that was a pretty good touch.
I should note, I suppose, that the director and writer, I think Russell stole the idea from someone who submitted a script to him. But when Russell, after the invasion of Iraq, he sort of came out to be like, hey, see, like I made this movie that was kind of predictive, right? When asked about how the Iraqis he interviewed had felt about the war in Iraq, this is the 2003 war, Russell said, every Iraqi I know is glad that Saddam is gone. I would completely disagree with Michael Moore about that. I think it's good that Saddam is gone. And I think basically the movie takes the position, is Iraq better off without Saddam? Yes. Is the world better off with this war? Not sure. I don't think so.
Sometimes filmmakers, I think, can make a movie that's greater than the sum of their own parts. Like,
I guess that was a lot of Americans' view at the time was, I think that Saddam is a bad guy, but I also don't know what would be better in Iraq. Saddam himself would always claim that he needed his specific brand of secular cruelty to keep Iraq controlled.
Yeah, correct. True, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, is the word stability in this movie a lot, or am I thinking...
It is, yes. Mark Wahlberg, during the torture scene, says that they did the war for stability.
Yes, like there's stability, that sometimes stability is like someone is stably torturing and murdering people for like 30 years.
One thing I kind of liked about it is I feel like there are some almost magical realism elements to it where it's grounded-ish. It takes place in a very particular historical moment. And then you have some kind of almost supernatural sorts of things that happen. I'm thinking in particular about the instigating event is that they find a treasure map in a guy's ass. As soldiers and civilians are surrendering, they strip down an Iraqi and they find the magic treasure map in his ass, which is actually double magic because there's invisible ink written on it that the special ops guy needs to see. And I was surprised at how the movie was actually interesting to look at many points. Jordano, I know you find the color saturation, the 90s color saturation pretty awful.
Yeah, I'm like, I get it. You're trying to make California look like Iraq. Enough with the color saturation. It looks ridiculous.
But in the scene where they're driving away and the mission goes tits up and the Iraqis are firing tear gas over them, and so we have this smoky desert and they're saved by these women who are clad in the burqas with gas masks on, and they look rather otherworldly as they silently in a procession just pick up the Louis Vuitton bags full of gold bars and walk them to a secret hideout in a cave. I was like, man, this looks pretty cool.
Yeah, they take a palette of real life things and put them together to make this very surreal scene. I like that too because it's kind of like the Act 1 transition of the movie. They have this village set that they do a few scenes in, and then they escape the village set, and at that point they get attacked by gas mortars, and those gas mortars turn the entire scene into a smoke cloud scene where now the village, the sky, your surroundings, the minefield, anything are now invisible, and it's like you've entered a completely different locale in the movie. Yeah, and then the gas mask people come out of the smoke. Yeah, the movie, it tries and sometimes fails to do these sorts of visual flourishes, and yeah, I appreciate it for it, even if it's sometimes a little odd. I was thinking the whole time, who directed this? Because there's sort of these almost Coens-like sort of whip, whip, whip flourishes, and there's even a scene at the beginning that I was like, that was like a Wes Anderson shot. What the heck was that? They did just the fun, dumb guy movie flourishes, then also did shit like the character moving in slow motion while this guy moves in fast motion to show how freaked out they are. I loved the day job cut, like that humorous Family Guy cut to like their shitty day jobs.
Which is elevated double. Like George Clooney says, what, do you want to go back to your day job? Because most of them are reservists. And you see they all have shitty drudgery jobs. So like Ice Cube is working at the airport. He's loading the bag explodes. Mark Wahlberg is working at an office. He's changing the copier. He's got ink all over his button-down shirt. And then it cuts to Spike Jonze's hillbilly, and instead of a job, he's just shooting stuffed animals on them.
Yeah, he's shooting a car with a shotgun. Yeah. Fuck, man. Yeah, that's another way the movie engages with its characters being human beings. And it works, because their dialogue is often extremely unnatural and extremely like dumb movie dialogue, but they're given so much humanity, especially the redneck. I love the redneck, the fourth king. Yeah, spoiler in the title, by the way.
You're right that the dialogue is kind of unnatural, but it still got a lot of laughs out of me. Some of the ways that they talk are very funny. It's like, get out of here. I'm trying to translate my Iraqi ass map or whatever.
Yeah, or like the way that Ice Cube doesn't have any issues with anti-Arab slurs unless it's a portmanteau of a slur that we would also use for black people.
Yeah.
Like negotiating which anti-Arab slurs should be allowed.
Yeah.
Boy, that sentence you just said was a nail biter.
I can't believe I made it through the whole thing.
I also love that this is an anti-journalist film. So the first time we see a journalist is when a journalist is having sex with George Clooney. Right? Making the point quite clear that the media is in bed with the American military, right? They're getting more than intel, if you catch my drift.
I felt bad for the Judy Greer character in this movie. If you're George Clooney and you need to give away a big story to a journalist, you got to give it to the woman you're having sex with, right? You can't give this to the woman that you don't like. I would feel pretty betrayed if I was Judy Greer. I'm having sex with someone and they're giving the story to a different journalist that I'm competing with.
But yeah, shots of just the absolute shamelessness of the media where she's like, I need a story. And they're like, do you want to do the burning Kuwaiti oil wells? This environmental catastrophe. She's like, no, it's been done to death. Everyone's doing it. Do you want to do
the birds,
right? The marshes. The pelicans.
Yeah.
That was an incredible scene.
Yeah.
It was, because at first I was laughing at her coldness towards the birds suffocating on oil, right? She's like, these fucking birds. And then she starts crying about it. Like she is affected, but her first reaction is her own self-interest to sell a story.
She cries about it, but not enough to actually do a story on it, right? This idea that this is a tragedy. It's sad. It makes me weep, but I need something new. I need novelty. I need the new thing.
The gold heist.
And even just seeing her talk, she has the most embarrassing way of talking. We see her do multiple cuts over and over again. She's asking just average grunt soldiers, do you think we've exorcised the ghosts of Vietnam? Just so clearly for the consumers of news back home, for the article heads back home who would talk this way. Some very fun anti-journalism content from the first CNN war, Operation Desert Storm. Okay, another thing I really liked about this movie is what it says without saying about American culture and the global reach. It's a very end of history movie coming out in 1999. So Giordano already mentioned the Iraqi torturer using the CD to force oil down Marky Mark's throat. But you have the scene where this guy who is torturing an American, whose family has been killed by an American, his first series of questions is asking Marky Mark about Michael Jackson, about why Michael Jackson did that to himself. Like the global reach of American culture to the point that even this villain character is talking about it. There's so many little moments like this. In the initial scenes where they're driving in the Humvee to go do their heist, first they're playing Bach. They're playing, the high culture of 18th century Europe. And you have the contrast between the Bach that's playing on the radio and the hood ornament of a Bart Simpson's doll that they're going to war with.
Such a great visual of, shooting footballs in the air with the Bart Simpson doll on the front. And what's Bart Simpson's catchphrase?
Don't have
a cow,
Mm.
man.
Oh my God, what? Damn, dude.
The animal that they explode as part of their shenanigans.
And then that's quickly followed up with another driving scene that's set to the fucking Beach Boys' I Get Around. I'm like, how perfect is this? They're driving around, as we have said over the past 2 hours and change, just bringing cataclysmic violence, apocalyptic violence to the country of Iraq. And they are playing bubblegum boomer pop from a boy band, the Beach Boys' I Get Around. And indeed, the Americans do, in fact, get around. And they even make sure to play the line from I Get Around. My buddies and me are getting real well known. Yeah, the bad guys know us and they leave us alone. Ba-da-da-da.
I thought the sepsis graphic was good too. First of all, showing you like how a bullet might kill you, but just the idea in general of like a foreign object entering the body and creating bile. Like, what does that sound like? Right? Maybe an allegory for the invasion in general.
Because then it's the bile that kills you.
Right. Yeah.
The bullet's just sitting there.
So yeah, anyway, we just wanted to talk a little bit about this movie because it's interesting that this historical moment is covered at all in a movie, right? There's this moment where Mark Wahlberg is telling the crowd, George Bush wants you to stand up for yourself. And so funny that we have a movie that represents this fairly specific moment in history where we were encouraging the people of Iraq to overthrow Saddam. And so this movie takes the position that we should have done more, but also that it's sort of futile to do anything. Whereas it could have towed the line a little bit more of like, well, why encourage it at all?
There are so many weird lines that show that David O. Russell is a real news head, where the commanding officer says to George Clooney quite explicitly, do you want to occupy Iraq? Have another Vietnam? Like, just the lines that are lifted from op-ed writers about this thing and putting it into the war. And multiple characters say, I don't even know what this war was about. The journalist says it, and I think one of our three kings says it. I don't know what this war was about. And that line can be read a couple of different ways. And I think that's kind of what's so genius about it. If the thesis is we should have done more, then I don't know what this war was about means why did we stop? Why did we liberate Kuwait but stop from going up against Saddam? Or you can read that line truly as saving Kuwait, the new world order. Like, what was this for? Especially in the context when the torturer character talks about all of the death and destruction that was wrought from all the American bombing.
And kudos to this movie for refusing to answer that. Again, the bar is so low that this feels like an anti-war film, and when it's not. Yeah. But the bar is so low that it really made me smile, which is its ambiguity, I guess. It's just interesting in 1999 that, like, yeah, we all take for granted that some of these things are true. Like, yeah, if you have something on your little videotape the military doesn't like, they're just going to take it from you. Yeah, like, a lot of this stuff is just motivated by greed. I feel like it would be hard to make that movie today. They wouldn't like that. Hollywood would not like that so much, you know? The sheer amount of Arabic in this movie.
The nature of the goods that Iraq stole from Kuwait was very funny, too. Like stereo systems and gadgets.
It's American consumer goods. Yes.
Right. Yes, exactly.
There's a scampering Iraqi soldier who has an armful of jeans as he tries to desert and find something else.
The loot make these constant props. Like, Mark Wahlberg gets imprisoned in a room full of, like, cell phones and jeans. When they first go to the bunker with the gold, right, at first they don't find the gold, they just find the regular loot. Yeah, and the guy is trying to sell him a CD player.
Yes, yeah. You know, he's trying to give him like a blender. He's like, for your wife.
Yeah, and then he's literally pitching him on the CD player, saying it's like the latest and greatest.
Yeah, and then Mark Wahlberg has to be like, no, there's too much distortion on that one.
Yeah.
Like, how familiar they are with consumer goods as well. There's like a movie-long fight over whether or not a Lexus makes a convertible.
Yes.
Hey, yeah, way to bring it in. That is like a consumer goods theme.
Yeah, so themes here, consumerism, liberal intervention, and the nature of the media in the Iraq War, which, you know, that's something people always talk about. Is the Gulf War was the first CNN war. Right.
There's a lot of fun stuff just going for it as a movie. The thing that I liked the whole time as like someone that gets really bent out of shape about shitty action scenes is they made this movie where everyone is a soldier with a gun, and it's like they had like a note somewhere in the room. As few of your problems need to be solved by gunfighting as possible. In fact, gunfighting I think usually ends in a negative most of the time in this movie. And I really love that. Like, they're doing these heists, but they find ways in the script to get around everyone being a shoot 'em up. Like in the final confrontation, they just established in a scene of dialogue, like, oh, these are Republican Guard, they're like real soldiers, so we won't be able to shoot our way through, right? And so they have to come up with this awesome plan using like the luxury cars, which I loved. But even earlier, their initial heist plan as 4 US soldiers is to go in literally like Speed and Violence style without shooting anybody and just like hold up papers and be like, we represent the US government, get down! Because they know the power that those words wield, just like the end of Zero Dark 30, when as soon as the guy speaks English, everyone stops, you know? The movie keeps doing that, where they find a way for a bunch of heavily armed dudes and a bunch of heavily armed dudes to confront each other and have it not be a shootout. It sometimes is, but it's cool when it is. There's not a scene that I can think of where the good guys are getting shot at like a zillion times and not getting hit for no reason. Like, the movie avoids a lot of pitfalls, and since I'm such a negative Nancy, that made me really like it.
No, it's a good movie. It's funny. It has bad politics, kind of, mostly. It tries to be nuanced, and I think it tries like JD said, to have some ambiguity. I don't think it's always successful. I think the film does come down on we should have done more. But when Mark Wahlberg is getting tortured, there's a throwaway line that I love where the torturer said, "I was trained by American spies," as a shout out to the 1980s Iraq-American relationship. Everything we spent 2 hours telling you about is reflected in some way in this film, which is why it's a great button for this episode. And yeah, if the movie has one particular thesis, it's when George Clooney says explicitly, "What's the most important thing in life?" And the most important thing in life is necessity. Because everyone in this movie feels like they are doing what is necessary. It's necessary to save Kuwait. It's necessary to not support the uprisings because we need our clean ending. It's necessary to give up the gold so that these people can be free. Like this idea that there are certain things that you don't always want to do, but you have to do is a recurring theme in the film. Well, thank you so much for listening to part 1 of our 3-part series on the Iraq War. We're approaching audiobook territory on this. Huge thank you to JD for coming on the pod for this marathon session.
Huge thank you for having me, as always.
And yeah, please like, subscribe, comment, engage, do all that stuff. We now have a Patreon with some bonus paywalled content, so you may notice that the numbers on the main feed don't always line up because we got to number stuff differently behind the paywall. So check out our Patreon for episodes on Waiting, Snakes on a Plane, and Troy. More to come soon.
Sweet, and including 2 more episodes or 3 more episodes on the invasion of Iraq.
Yes, join us next time as we discuss the Bush administration selling the war to the American people and the world at large, where we will also review the Iannucci film In the Loop. All right, that's all we got for you today. Ciao, ciao.
Peace.
Hey, Saddam, you helped me get rid of Terrence and Phillip, and I appreciate that. But why are framed pictures of you going up all over Canada?
Huh? Oh, that? Don't worry, guy. You just need a rest.
No, I don't need a rest. I want to know what this is all about.
Hello to my Canadian friends. Everybody relax. Take a rest. Put your feet up. Those dogs are barking. You may have noticed some changes to your country. Don't worry about that. The changes will continue. I'm here to announce once and for all that Canada will now be known as New Baghdad. Kuluk kulak. You will bow down to me as your ruler. You will obey my laws or you will be killed.